Every time new documents related to Jeffrey Epstein are released, a predictable cycle begins. First, there's shock at the content, then outrage at the names, and this is followed by a renewed belief that this time, disclosure will finally bring accountability. But each time, that belief just dissipates. We're left feeling like something huge has been revealed, but nothing has actually been resolved. The issue here isn't a lack of information, it's that we're fundamentally misreading what the Epstein case actually represents.
You see, this cycle of shock and dissipation, it points to something systemic. When we treat it as an isolated scandal, the case seems like an anomaly, a single rogue individual who exploited his access until he was finally exposed. But if you look at it through an institutional lens, Epstein wasn't an aberration at all. He was a functional piece within a much broader architecture of power, one that relies less on rules or laws than it does on leverage and enforced silence.
So to really understand what's going on, we have to start by addressing the fundamental misdiagnosis of the event itself. To frame this whole thing as just a moral failing of one person or even a small group of people is to miss the point completely. It actually obscures the institutional function that was being performed. So to see it clearly, we have to shift away from a story about individuals and toward a structural analysis. Think about it. Elite systems span all these competing sectors: finance, politics, media, each with their own incentives and constantly shifting alliances. In an environment like that, coordination almost never depends on trust or some shared ideology. Stability has to be achieved through other means. And in this context, formal rules and regulations, they take a backseat to the raw power of structural leverage. And that brings us to the core mechanism that enforces order within these systems: leverage. Let's define leverage clinically. It's simply the possession of information that can impose an irreversible cost on someone, whether that's reputational, legal, or financial. And when that's the case, silence isn't something you're forced into, it becomes the only rational choice. As soon as that vulnerability exists, rational people will choose silence to protect themselves. Now, we have to make a crucial distinction here. There are minor compromises. Think financial misconduct. Those are survivable. They can be managed, settled, and moved on from. But then there's what we could call terminal compromise. These are acts that are socially unrecoverable. Exposure guarantees permanent reputational annihilation, and the threat of that fundamentally changes a person's incentives. The sheer extremity of the acts associated with Epstein, it often seems inexplicable. But from a leverage perspective, it's actually central to how the whole mechanism works. The taboo nature of the behavior isn't some incidental detail, it's functional. It's precisely what makes the leverage durable, ensuring that anyone who thinks about defecting knows it would be an act of self-destruction. Of course, this kind of leverage doesn't just operate in a vacuum. It functions across a wide, deeply entangled network. Epstein's role in all of this was structural. He was a connector. He wasn't some central command figure, but he was positioned right at the intersection of otherwise disconnected sectors, linking finance to academia, politics to tech. His value wasn't about shared beliefs, it was about creating network entanglement. And what this entanglement created was a state of interdependent vulnerability. Once you have enough people compromised across these rival factions, no single person can speak out without triggering massive collateral damage to their own interests and allies. This brings us to a concept you could call mutually assured exposure. It's a state where stability isn't achieved through shared values, but through shared guilt and shared vulnerability. And importantly, this isn't the result of some centralized conspiracy. It just emerges from distributed incentives. It's simply the rational enforcement mechanism for silence. So where do all these document releases and public investigations fit into a framework like this? Well, what looks like a destabilizing push for transparency often functions more like a calibrated release valve, a kind of managed decompression. A partial disclosure happens. It imposes a reputational cost on certain individuals, which temporarily satisfies public pressure. But the core architecture of incentives, that's left completely untouched. This shows us a pretty significant difference between the temporary shock of naming names and the long-term adaptation of the system itself. Disclosures might illuminate what happened, but they don't map the network that allowed it to happen. So the revelations are damaging, yes, but they're also contained. Real structural change would require mapping the incentives, not just listing the actors. And this leads us to the system's primary response when a node becomes a liability. It's containment, not correction. So we should ask ourselves, when an individual like Epstein becomes a net liability, and the system adjusts to preserve itself, is what we're seeing justice? Or is it simply risk management?
From a purely institutional perspective, their removal functions as containment. Epstein's prosecution and his death are perfect examples of this. The risk he represented eventually became greater than his structural value, which prompted his isolation in order to preserve the larger system. Any moral evaluation is really secondary to that cold logic.
So finally, let's address that feeling of incomplete resolution the public has and get to the real reason for the system's continuity. A lot of the public's frustration comes from a false expectation that exposure must produce accountability. But in these highly interconnected systems, adaptation replaces collapse. When a disclosure threatens not just individuals, but entire networks that are seen as valuable, the system tends to absorb the information rather than break under it. The mechanisms that enforce this order are incredibly resilient because they aren't obvious. They're decentralized, they're privatized, and they're embedded within perfectly legitimate economic and social activities. And that makes them very, very hard to dismantle. And that's why the Epstein case is illustrative, not exceptional. It demonstrates just how persistent these informal enforcement mechanisms are. Without fundamental changes to the underlying incentive structures, any future revelations will almost certainly replicate the exact same pattern: disclosure, shock, some partial consequences, and then stabilization. The architecture remains. The mechanisms of leverage persist. The silence adapts. This case demonstrates not an aberration, but the rational calculus of elite continuity.